We'd like to get started. Unfortunately, we have abbreviated periods today because of the 2-hour delayed arrival. So I want you to have full advantage of being able to hear Dr. Richardson. You have a unique opportunity this morning to hear from one of the Tuskegee Airmen. Dr. Richardson has been out of the service since 1946. So we're talking almost 70 years now out of the service. So you have an excellent opportunity here to hear from someone who has lived the history that you've been learning about. Dr. Richardson.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Hines. Now you know dinosaurs can talk. I'd like to introduce fellow Tuskegee Airman, Aaron Watkins. Aaron is Aaron is second generation, but he has a Bronze Star as a helicopter pilot in Vietnam. So I'm always happy to have a distinguished member with me. How many of you saw Red Tails? Have you ever seen the movie Red Tails? Red Tails? Or those who didn't see it, get the CD. It's a great movie. It's about our guys. Nothing in that movie was made up for the movie. All the action was taken from our combat record. All the stuff you saw there was real. Many people felt that Tuskegee Airmen were the first military pilots, but in studying history, this is Black History Month. Black people are involved in every day of the year, and let alone every month or every week of the year. But one of the early black pilots was a guy named Eugene Bullard. Eugene Bullard's home was in Columbus, Georgia, and yet he becomes a fighter pilot for the French in World War I. Eugene Bullard ran away from home. The racism was extremely rugged back then. His grandfather had been lynched and all kinds of things were happening. Eugene Bullard ran away from home, and he stowed away on a German ship at Newport News, Virginia. And when that German ship got back to Europe, Eugene Bullard was on it. And Bullard had learned that there's this country across the ocean called France, where black men were treated more or less the same as white men. Of course, Bullard was anxious to get there, to get away from horrendous stuff in Georgia. So he finally did get to France. France did not have slavery. France didn't have the racism that existed in the United States. So France had no difficulty having a black man in its Air Force. And Bullard was credited with shooting down 2 German planes. About 7 or 8 years ago, there was a movie titled Flyboys. That movie was about French guys being trained to be pilots in World War I. Among that group of trainees was one black guy. No special mention was made of him in the movie, and he just happened to be a trainee that had black skin. But that was Eugene Bullard from America. And that was 1917. We had to sue the Army in 1940 in order to be pilots in the United States Air Force. Early on, after World War I, airplanes became a very famous way of having fun. And a lot of people would rent airplanes and get airplane rides just for the fun of it. And a lot of Americans did. And girls always want to butt in on everything. I'm glad they do because I have 8 sisters, so I'm familiar with that. But this young lady, Bessie Coleman wanted to fly an airplane. They wouldn't give blacks flight instructions around her where she was living in Chicago. So she was urged to do what Bullard did, go to France to learn to fly. So in 1921, Bessie Coleman went to France, learned to fly, came back to this country a year later, and she went around giving airplane rides and demonstrations and urging other blacks to get involved in aviation. And many of them did. Flying clubs were started at her behest. I became interested in flying as a kid, about 5 years old. I saw this air circus put on by the 5 Blackbirds. And I see these things up in the air flying around the clouds and, circling and diving, and they land and people get out of them. And that was most impressive for a 5-year-old kid to see that. And from that time on, I'd wanted to be a pilot. Well, there were hundreds of other black guys who wanted to fly airplanes. A young man that, very famous for us, a man by the name of Charles Alfred Anderson, wanted to fly an airplane. He lived in Bryn Mawr, just outside of Philadelphia. And he wanted to fly in the worst kind of way, but none of the airports in that area would give a black kid flight instructions. And Anderson went from airport to airport, no flight instructions. One of his jobs was cleaning airplanes. And airplanes threw off a lot of smoke and dirt in those days. And his job was to clean the airplanes. So he knew all about the outer surfaces, the insides of the airplanes. So out of sheer desperation to want to learn how to fly, Charles Alfred Anderson bought an oil-used airplane and taught himself to fly. And you figure, whoa, how do you do something like that? Well, stop and think. Who taught the Wright brothers to fly their airplane? The Wright brothers invented their steerable airplane in 2003 or 4. Who taught them how to fly it? They taught themselves how to fly it. Well, now it's 1929. There are a lot of books and articles written about airplanes, and I'm sure Anderson read everything he could get his hands on about airplanes. So no big stretch for him to one day decide to, well, my turn to fly. So he lines the thing up, and away he went. He was still flying at the age of 86. And he eventually becomes an instructor at Tuskegee. He was the chief instructor at Tuskegee. And it turns out that he was Aaron Anderson's flight instructor at Tuskegee. A whole lot of guys were interested in flying because airplanes were such a popular thing. It was such a thrill to see you think of yourself being up there like the birds. Well, during the 30s, you probably, well, if you're reading now, I guess. But at any rate, during the 30s, Hitler starts doing his thing over in Europe. And the United States realizes that, well, we've got to build up the army. Now, from history, you've learned that there was this economic crash in 1929. And, of course, a whole lot of institutions went to pot, including the Army. Well, now that Hitler's doing this thing in Europe, we've got to build up the Army. Armies need airplanes, and airplanes need pilots. But there's this economic depression, and people aren't flying airplanes as much as they were before. So how are you going to get pilots? Well, the government started civilian pilot training programs in colleges all around the country. The idea is that we'll let a lot of young men learn how to fly, and then we can perhaps get some of them to be military pilots. Well, hundreds of guys went to those flight schools, but they made no provisions for the black guys that wanted to fly. And there were thousands of black guys who wanted to fly airplanes. So they start the civil rights organizations, and others start agitating for black men to get the same opportunity in these flight programs as white guys did. Well, there are two guys, Dale White and Chauncey Spencer. They did a 10-city flight tour to demonstrate the ability of blacks to fly airplanes and also to drum up support for the notion of blacks having these flying programs. Well, on one of their flights, they flew from Chicago down to Washington, D.C. And when they get to Washington, D.C., they by chance bump into Junior Senator Harry Truman. And Junior Senator Truman said, look, you guys flew that thing from Chicago down here. I don't see why you can't fly for the Army. I'll do whatever I can to help you, to help you get in. And Truman was true to his word. President Truman, with Everett Dirksen and several others, sponsored legislation where 6 black colleges would have these flying programs. West Virginia State was first, and there was Howard, Hampton, Tuskegee, Delaware State. Delaware State still has a flight program. North Carolina, AT&T. There was also a school in Chicago. Willa Brown and her husband, Coffey, they had a flight school. So now you got these 6 flight schools where black men can go to learn to fly, and they'll go there by the dozens to learn to fly. And the one young man, Yancey Williams, he finished the flight program at Howard University. And then at that time, Charles Alfred Anderson was instructing at Howard University. And Yancey Williams finished the program. He goes to the Army with his flight certificate. He said, listen, I want to be an Army pilot. I've got my certificate from the Commerce Department. I'm a certified pilot. 3 times he goes there, and 3 times the Army refuses to take him. So they get with the NAACP, and they sue the Army. And with that lawsuit, the Army agreed, okay, we'll have Squadron 99 for black pilots. Now, there had been an effort to get a representative number of blacks in the military. Back in history, they never wanted black men to be soldiers. George Washington did not want black men in his army, but he had to take them because that's what the different militias offered. Turned out that 1 out of every 7 soldiers in George Washington's army was a black man. So now there's an effort to have a representative number of blacks in the military. And fortunately for us, there are always people that were against slavery. There were people that were championing for freedom for everybody. And we were very fortunate in that a young lady named Eleanor Roosevelt, President Roosevelt's wife, was one of these courageous people that were doing whatever she could to help the downtrodden. So Mrs. Roosevelt is involved in getting a representative number of blacks in the military. And she's at a conference at Hampton. And while she was there, she went over to Tuskegee to check out their polio treatment program. And she noticed that there were black men flying airplanes over there. And she said, whoa, they told me black men couldn't fly, but I want to fly with one of you. And of course, the entourage went crazy. Oh my goodness, you're going to fly with a black man, he's going to crack up and we're going to get blamed for letting you go up. Well, Mrs. Roosevelt was a very strong-willed woman, and she insisted upon getting a ride in one of these airplanes with the black pilots. Now, Tuskegee had enticed Chief Alfred Anderson to come down to Tuskegee, first to go out to Dayton and pick up a new Waco airplane and bring it back to Tuskegee and be the head of their advanced flight program. So now Anderson is at Tuskegee, and the man who had taught himself to fly in 1929 is now, in 1941, flying Mrs. Roosevelt around the field at Tuskegee. And we think Mrs. Roosevelt had a lot to do with Tuskegee getting a contract to be the place where black men would go for their primary flight training. In the primary school, we had 42 black instructors in the primary school. And in the primary school, we started learning to fly 2-wing airplanes with 2 cockpits. And this young man here is named Roscoe Draper. He's still with us. He's with the Philadelphia group. Roscoe is 94 years of age. And he still comes out to our meetings. He's got a cane, he's got 3rd leg to help, but he's still right in there in spirit. Well, at any rate, they start training pilots for the Army in the summer of 41. Anderson was with Mrs. Roosevelt in June of 41, so later in 41, they start training black men to be pilots for the Army Air Corps. Now, this is after that lawsuit. And so far as the Army was concerned, this is an experiment to prove that black men did not have the necessities to be pilots. They were basing that on a War College report. In 1925, the United States Army War College at Carlisle Barracks, Carlisle, Pennsylvania, they put out a secret report, supposedly about the psychological and moral and physical characteristics of the Negro. And one of the things it says was that the Negro was low on the scale of human evolution. He was unmoral, he was lazy, and all kinds of negative stuff was in this report. So thinking about that report, the Army saying, well, no way black men can be pilots, but you guys got this lawsuit going, you're causing us trouble. We're going to prove that you cannot be pilots, so we're going to start off with small classes just to show you that you can't do it. So the first class at Tuskegee started off with 13 students. At the end of the 40-week flight program, that 40 weeks was actually 4 schools: pre-flight, primary, basic, and advanced. White cadets went to 4 different airfields for these different schools. At Tuskegee, everything was done right there within a 10-mile radius of Tuskegee Institute. So that first class starts off with 13. At the end of the 40 weeks, there were 5 guys. And every 5 weeks, they would start a new class on the end. Every 5 weeks, there's a graduation. So the next class, the next graduation, there were only 3 guys in that class. The following class had 4, and the class after that had 14. So now we have the 26 men that are needed to fill up Squadron 99. These are the first 26 men of the 99th Fighter Squadron. In the center of the group, there's this young man, Benjamin Davis Jr., Benjamin O. Davis Jr. Benjamin Davis Jr. was a West Point graduate. He entered West Point in 1932. He's the only black cadet there, and they tried to force him to quit. Davis was ostracized for the 4 years he was at West Point. That meant no one was permitted to associate with him socially. No one was allowed to talk to him as a friend. They wouldn't even let him have a roommate. Benjamin Davis spent 4 years without talking to anyone. And your teachers tell me some of you guys can't keep quiet for a class period. Well, Benjamin Davis spent 4 years without able to talk to anyone as a friend. While he was at school, when he went home, of course, sure. When Ben Davis's class was graduated in 1936, there were 276 cadets graduating that year. Benjamin Davis Jr. was number 35 from the top. After being ostracized and treated inhumanely for 4 years, he's still at the top 13% of the 1936 class at West Point. His dream was to become an Army pilot. But with your fantastic record at West Point and all your great attributes, you got a problem. You got color in your skin. So you cannot be an Army pilot. So Davis was sent to Fort Benning to the infantry. But once these flying programs got started, and Davis was in like the first one, as I said, the first one to come out of Tuskegee. And he became by this time he's a captain. And he's the highest ranking guy in charge of Squadron 99. So now, well, I won't ask you when we got into World War II. I know all of you know that we got into World War II on December 8th, the day after Pearl Harbor. President Roosevelt declared war. So all of you know that on December 8th, 1941, we are at war. December 8, 1941, we're at war. Comes the summer of 1942, August of 42, Squadron 99 is fully formed. They've been flying the P-40. They've learned, close formation flying, air-to-air gunnery, air-to-ground gunnery, dive bombing, all the stuff you need for combat. They're highly patriotic, anxious to go and fight for the freedom of Europeans. But we don't have freedom ourselves. None of the commanders in Japan or Europe would take a black squadron. We've been at war for 9 months. You've got a squadron of men, highly trained, highly patriotic, anxious to go shed their blood for somebody else's freedom. They don't have freedom ourselves. It took another 8 months. It took another 8 months. It wasn't until April or May of 1943 before Squadron 99 got an assignment to go to combat. They were sent to North Africa, and eventually the Allies drove, they got to North Africa in May of 43, and the commander that they were assigned to didn't want them, but he had to take them, and he sort of ignored them and sent them up on some lousy missions and so forth. But finally in July, one of our guys did shoot down a German plane. A guy named Charles Hall shot down a German aircraft. And oh man, morale went sky high. But there were no more assignments that put them near enemy aircraft for another 6 months. It wasn't until January of 1944 before Squadron 99 was sent. Well, they were transferred to several different groups, but in 1944, they were with the 79th Group. And the commander, Colonel Bates, was a fair-minded, intelligent guy, and he sent Squadron 99 up on the missions with all his other guys. A group normally has 3 squadrons. And they assigned the 99th to Colonel Bates, and whenever his guys went up, he sent the 99th along with them. Well, in January of 44, the Allies invaded Italy through the port of Anzio, Italy. Anzio is just a little south of Rome, about 30 miles south of Rome. The Allies invade through Italy, and now we have to have air cover to fly around to make sure the Germans don't come in and mess up our invasion. Well, Squadron 99 was patrolling the skies over the invasion, and in a week's time, our guys shot down 17 German aircraft. So now they realize that, hey, those black guys can fly. So now they start using them in more important, more strategic assignments. Well, as the war went on, they chased the Germans out of Italy. Now the British were bombing at night. They were doing their bombing at night, so the guys on the ground can't see them and shoot them down. But the bombing was not as accurate as they would like. Well, at least the United States didn't feel as though it was. So the United States established the 15th Strategic Bombing Group. And the 15th had B-24s and B-17s. Each of those bombers carried a crew of 10. There were 10 men in each bomber. Well, men there, most of these guys were 18, 19, and the old man was 25. So these guys are in a bomber. If your bomber gets shot down, I tell the kids, your bomber gets shot down, you have to walk home. But I think you know a little better than that. Well, on one morning, 60 bombers were shot down, 10 men each. Just that one morning, 600 young men met there. I'm sure there are not 600 people in here. But that one morning, 600 young men met their fate. And General Twining, who commanded the 15th Air Force, realized that we can't sustain losses like that. So we got to have better protection for the bombers. So they asked Colonel Davis, who now has 4 groups. Now keep in mind, well, let me refresh. Squadron 99 went over first. They were sent to North Africa. They had Colonel Davis go back to the States and train 3 more squadrons, Squadron 100, Squadron 301, and Squadron 302. Those 3 squadrons headed over to Europe in January of 44, around the same time that 99th Squadron was patrolling the skies over Anzio. So they got to keep all these black guys together. So they put the 99th with those other 3 squadrons, and Colonel Davis is commanding. So now Colonel Davis has the 332nd Fighter Group that has squadrons 99, 100, 301, 302. And General Twining asked Colonel Davis if his guys would come over and protect the white boys and the bombers, because they're getting shot down like flies over there. So they eventually give our guys P-51s. They originally gave our guys P-47s for escort. The P-47 was a powerful airplane, but it was a gas guzzler. It had 2 9-cylinder engines. It carried 8 machine guns. It weighed 7 tons. But the thing could only fly for about 2 hours, and you better be somewhere to put that thing back on the ground. Well, they gave our guys P-51s. They put in the the British Merlin engine in the P-51s. And our guys started protecting the bombers, for the most part, with P-51s, the tails painted red. The P-51 carried just 6 guns. It had 3 guns in each wing, and it could also carry some light bombs and so forth. Our guys escorted bombers on 200 missions, starting in April of 44. April of 44 until 45, our guys escorted bombers on 200 different missions. And for the longest time, the record was that none of the bombers being protected by the Red Tails got shot down. Now, here of late, they claim they found records where there were some losses. But our guys had the lowest number of bomber losses of any of the fighter groups in the 15th Air Force. Our side guys saved a whole lot of white boys' lives because each bomber had 10 guys, and our guys had no losses, so we saved a whole lot of lives flying those red-tailed airplanes. The bomber guys learned that after, when you come back from a mission, the intelligence officer debriefs the pilots. What did you see? When did you see it? What kind of airplane? All kinds of information. And from the debriefings, the guys learned that those red-tail guys haven't lost any airplanes. So the bomber guys kept, we want the red tails to protect us. The bomber guys called them red-tail angels. And the bomber guys kept asking for the 332nd group, kept asking so often that our commander, Benjamin Davis, named his airplane by request. We are here. Now, they at first didn't want black men to be pilots. But now they find that the best protection you can get from those black guys that are flying those red-tail airplanes, which shows you that you don't judge a book by its cover, as the old saying goes. You don't judge a person by the color of their skin or the texture of their hair. When you go back and study the development of people, you'll find out that all humans started off in Africa. And because they moved away from Africa, away from the strong sun and the equator, their bodies had to adapt to weaker sun. So the bodies lost the pigmented protection. And that's why they became light skin and light hair as a matter of adjusting to climate. But we're all out of Africa. All people are capable of doing the same thing, given the same teachings and opportunities. They all do the same thing. And we lose a tremendous amount of talent by blocking some people from developing their skills. The country loses tremendous amount. During the course of the war, our guys shot down 112 enemy aircraft, air-to-air combat. We shot up 150 aircraft on the ground. Those who saw the movie Red Tails saw a guy named Lightning, call sign Lightning, go down and shoot up a train engine from the front. Well, our guys shot up 57 train engines. Those train engines are pulling lines of boxcars full of supplies for the enemy. If you knock out the engine, then those boxcars don't get to the enemy. They just sit there. And the enemy goes hungry or goes without ammunition or whatever. Our guys also sank a destroyer. This red pin that I had that I so proudly wear, I gave a talk for the State Department in Italy, among other places. And I was very happy to get to the city of Trieste in northern Italy, because it was at the Bay of Trieste when our guys sank that destroyer. Now, in the movie, you saw one guy go down at this ship, but actually there were 6 or 7 guys returning home from a mission. After you've escorted the bombers to their target, the bombers drop their bombs and they go home. And then the fighter guys go back home. But on the way back home, if a fighter guy sees something down there of interest, you're free to go down and have a little target practice. Well, our guys were coming back from escorting in Yugoslavia. They passed over the city of Trieste and they see this ship sitting out in the harbor. Now, they still have ammunition left, so they start firing on this ship. This ship was carrying torpedoes for submarines, and their 50 caliber bullets set off the torpedoes, which exploded and wrecked this ship. When the guys get back home, they tell intelligence, "Hey, we sank a ship," and nah, come on, not with just machine gun. Well, look, it just happens that every fighter plane. Well, I didn't mean to show that one, but it's a good example. Fighter planes have a camera. There's a camera port. When you fire the gun, that's a P-47, incidentally. When you fire the guns, the camera takes a picture of whatever you were firing at. They said, well, look, develop our gun, or develop our film. They developed the gun camera film, and lo and behold, there it is. And one of the guys filmed, they see this thing blowing up, so they have to give our guys credit for sinking a destroyer. Is that us? Okay, well, at that, I thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Hines, for the opportunity.
Thank you, Dr. Richardson.